Díobh go léir, before we jump into the final episode of season 2 of How to Be Irish, I just have one thing that I want to ask you. I'm asking you to donate the price of a coffee. I've set up a link. You'll be able to find it in the show notes. If you're watching it on YouTube, the link will be there. If you're watching it on Spotify, it'll also be there. Same goes for Apple Podcasts. It'll be there in the show description. This is a link to my Patreon, and essentially you can sign up to Patreon as a free member, but this is a particular post that I am selling. So the idea being that you just pay me the $5. Sorry, I could only set it up as dollars. You pay me the $5, which is roughly the price of a coffee, just to say thanks so much for putting this podcast together. I enjoyed it. I would recommend that if you are doing it, do it with your browser, because if you do it on the app on your phone, they're going to charge you extra on top of that $5. So if you just go into the browser, or open it up in your browser on your phone, you can do that as well. You can pay for that post, which is essentially the same thing as sending me the price of a coffee. And I'd really, really appreciate that. It helps me to cover things like technical gear, like the stuff that you're looking at here. Also my software that I'm talking to you on right now, that I host my guests on, editing software, hosting software, marketing software, all that kind of good stuff. So it helps me cover the costs of all of that. If you can't afford it, then I would ask you to post it on your Instagram story, send it to a friend, something else, help me out in some other way. I'd really, really appreciate that. Let's get into it. Regina Sexton is a culture, food, and culinary historian, food writer, broadcaster, and cook. She has been researching and publishing in the field of Irish food and culinary history from 1993. And since then, she has been Ireland's leading food and culinary historian, promoting this field of study at both academic and popular levels. Regina is also a graduate of Ballymaloe Cookery School, holding a certificate in food and cookery. She's the programme manager of the MA in Food Studies and Irish Foodways at University College Cork. In 2001, she researched, wrote, and presented an 8-part RT1 television documentary series called A Little History of Irish Food. Currently, she's also working as a researcher and coordinator on the Horizon funded project titled Relish, where Relish stands for Reframing European Gastronomy Legacy Through Innovation, Sustainability, and Heritage. Regina, you're so welcome to How to Be Irish. How are you today?
Great. Thank you, Una. Delighted to be here.
It's great to have you here. So I'm a bit of a foodie, like I love food. So I'm very excited to chat to you today all about Irish food. Something though that I sometimes notice is that people often on the outside looking in, they look at Irish cuisine and they kind of view it as plain and boring and bland. Do you think that that's a fair reflection of it?
Yeah, there's never a yes or no answer to these big questions. On one level, yes, but on another level, no. Because you have to, I suppose, you have to look around and poke around a little bit in that perception of things somewhat. And you have to think about, who's doing the looking, what time are they looking at, whose diet are they looking at, or whose food culture are they looking at. Sometimes in these kind of ways of looking, the focus or the gaze tends to be on a kind of a mainstream culture. So if you're looking at a mainstream Irish food culture, we'll say from maybe the end of the 19th century until about the 1960s. So that's almost, we'll say, almost 100 years, really, in a post-famine environment with various different things going on, not just food-wise, but also economically and politically. And if you look at food in a mainstream, very generalized way in that regard, I would say, yeah, the food was very plain and it was very simple. And in that simplicity, there is an element of blandness. Some of us have memories, and this is where you're talking about memory, recalling a past rather than a history recalling a past. So if you use memory to recall a past, again, it depends on what age you are, of course, but if you talk to maybe people who are maybe over 40 and they recall their memories of food, again, it depends on whether they're in an urban or a rural context. But generally speaking, I'm a historian, so I have to cover everything with all of these multiple caveats. But if you ask people to remember back into the 20th century, they will remember a diet that was fairly simple and straightforward. It was, and again, this is a bit of a stereotype, but this is what a lot of us grew up with. It would have been a diet that was made up with meat, potatoes and vegetables. There was that trio on the plate every day. And that trio might have kind of altered depending on what the variety of meat and vegetables were And it could have varied as well in terms of the cooking procedure. So you might get meat that was baked in the oven. You might get meat that was roasted, rarely roasted, because roasting is outside an oven context. It might have been stewed, or it might have been in a casserole in that regard, or it could even have been boiled. And then the potatoes would have been boiled, or they could have been mashed or roasted. And invariably, the vegetables were boiled as well. And there might have been a sauce if you stretched to a white sauce or a gravy or something like that. And that was your kind of dinner makeup. And that was fairly bland and simple and straightforward, with a kind of a repetitive pattern of eating. So you might have the leftovers of the roast on Monday. You might have had some cut of meat on the Tuesday. On the Friday, you would have had fish, because it was still a fast day until well into the 20th century. And then Sunday was the roast, which was looked forward to in many ways by a lot of people. Um, and you'd have a pattern. Every day might have a certain dish or a certain type of dinner that was associated with the Monday, the Tuesday, the Wednesday, the Friday, and the Sunday, and so on. So in that regard, I think, yeah, it is very simple. It's very bland in that regard. And I often think that when you have an increase in the consumption of fast food and takeaway foods in Ireland, it would have been a lot of Chinese foods initially, and Indian food, and then all variations of that as you go through time. I often wonder, and again, this is just anecdotal in my wondering, I wonder, was the attraction to that because it was so highly flavoured, and
Mm.
such a distance between the bland dish of Irish food that we've just described, where everything was cut up, it was different shapes, it was always in a sauce, and it was always in a highly flavoured sauce. And I wonder, did that represent a whole different world, not in terms of kind of the ethnicity world, but also the flavour world and the presentation world there? I just wonder that. I don't have any anecdotal evidence or that's anecdotal. I don't have any evidence to support that, but it's something that strikes me as being significant.
Yeah, that's really interesting, actually. I've never thought about it like that. And you mentioned the idea of having the same dinner every day each week. I definitely grew up with that. Like, we'd always have certain things like pasta on Mondays, or like you also mentioned the idea of like these very strong flavors to kind of contrast against these what might be, to some people, very bland meals. And yeah, like feel like a lot of people who cook at home will reach for, the Mexican kind of taco kit now, or the jar of Dalmio sauce. And you said they like that like real saucy flavored thing. So I'm wondering, is that all tied in together? That's very interesting.
Well, when I was growing up, Una, pasta, we didn't have pasta and we didn't have Mexican. These were unheard of things. And the way that the week was organized was that the meat would change on the plate and the vegetables would change. So it was always a protein, like a meat element. It could have been beef or lamb or chicken or pork, usual. And the vegetable would change. The potato was the same. That the carbohydrates stayed the same, usually. Um, and then you get this change over to like what your memory is, which is really interesting. The patterning is the same,
Hmm.
whereas a dish is fixed to the day. But now you get a change in terms of the carbohydrate. It might be pasta, or it could be rice, or it could be, if it's Mexican, it could be based on corn.
Hmm.
So that's really interesting. So that's kind of two things at once. It's the patterning and the fixing today remains the same, but the variety of food has changed. And that's what's happened, I suppose, in eating habits, not just in Ireland, but if you think about the global north, that's what's been happening there since after World War II, after 1950 onwards. So I think in your memory, there's a bit more flavour and the palate is excited more by your flavours. Whereas if you went back a generation before you, maybe 20, 25 years, it is very bland and it is very static and the flavours are minimal, really. And I think that's where maybe the reputation comes from. And then in many cases, I suppose the cooking didn't help. You had things like boiled fish, which sounds horrendous and probably was. And I have memories of that. Sometimes, the cooking didn't help the vegetables either, where they were cooked to within an inch of their lives. So those things didn't help,
No, definitely. That's
reputationally wise.
That's for sure. I'm just thinking about a piece of broccoli that pretty much disintegrates as soon as it hits the plate, you know? But yeah, so you mentioned there you see that change, right? So if we look back, what are some classic dishes that you think we may have forgotten about? What are some heritage dishes that we should be aware of?
This is another complicated question for Ireland because Ireland's food story is quite interesting in that if you look at, like we've talked about the blandness and all that sort of stuff within memory and nostalgia. But if you leap back another maybe 100 years, again in time, there's another significant thing that's happening here in the story of Irish food, I suppose, from a historical perspective. And that's what's happening from the end of the 18th century until into the famine years, starting in 1845. And what's happening there is that for a certain demographic of Irish society, particularly the rural, less well off, the rural poor, if you like, but there's gradations even with that. Within that, what's happening is that the potatoes is starting to dominate their diets increasingly, and even more so when you come on to the early decades of the 19th century, 1810, 20, 30, and obviously into the 80s. And what's happening within that 2 or 3 generational span for Irish people of a certain demographic is that they are kind of pushing out a lot of the foods and the dishes that they would have eaten, and they're increasingly replacing those by a restricted diet, an increasingly restrictive diet of potatoes, and not just potatoes, but it's coming down to single varieties of potatoes and so on, which of course is, in terms of food security, is highly problematic and invariably, as we know, ends in famine in 1845. So when you talk about heritage dishes for a lot of people in that regard, they're gone because they've been pushed out and they've been displaced and replaced by a carbohydrate heavy diet of milk and potatoes for a lot of people. So the sense of continuity of traditional dishes is interrupted in that regard by the potato. And then if you look outside that particular demographic, um if you look at a kind of a middle class culture or an upper class elite culture, a lot of that food culture is coming in from our nearest neighbour, which is the United Kingdom or Britain at this point. So a lot of the foods that are coming in that people are aspiring to and preparing and consuming have a very strong English signature, if you like, of identity wise and profile wise and ingredient and cooking wise. So when you think about Irish heritage foods, it's kind of problematic in many ways because they're not there, or they are very strong ties to different cultures. And obviously these foods were there, but the other problem when it comes to Ireland is that there's a lack of evidence when it comes to describing dietary patterns. So the evidence isn't there to describe it. Okay, so you don't have, for example, which is kind of a strange thing. Ireland doesn't have a literary tradition in terms of food writing. So what I mean in that regard specifically is Ireland doesn't have a tradition of writing down recipes that would codify and set down and structurally embed in a culture a certain way of dealing with ingredients in a cooking method, right? So that doesn't exist for Ireland. Where the recipes do exist, and that doesn't happen in Ireland until you come into about the early 20th century for Ireland. But where the recipes do exist, because they do exist, is they exist in manuscript form that, like handwritten books of recipes, they're called manuscript receipts or manuscript recipes. They exist for the elite cultures like the big houses and the big landed estates. They exist for certain middle class cohorts as you come into the 19th century. And they're written in English. And a lot of those are taken from English influence, or they're taken from books that have been published collections of recipes. And for the most part, they're coming in from Britain as well.
Okay.
So it's not easy to talk about kind of heritage foods because there isn't a solid historical evidential record of what's going on in that regard. So you have to deal then with sources that are kind of talking around food, if you like. So there is mentions of food, and sometimes if it's a very good source, there will be mentions about how that food is prepared, for instance. But it's nothing at all like a recipe where there's quantities and, that structured way, that very formalized way of ingredients and how to put those ingredients together in a method section. That doesn't exist for Ireland.
Okay, so is it true then that we are missing we could have far more information on our food had they been writing this down in as you say, like a recipe format?
Yeah, you could. No, but and then I suppose if you do a comparative then, again to our closest neighbour, which is really interesting, what you see happening with England is that they have traditions of recipes going back to the medieval period. Now, they would be recipes associated with very, 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 very wealthy in society, and particularly those associated with the court and the king and the aristocracy and all of that sort of stuff. But then as they go into the 18th century, well, when you go into the late 16th and into the 17th centuries. And of course, you have the invention of the printing press and things like that then as well. They start producing printed collections of recipes, and the recipes start filtering down to different social groups. So they start filtering down to the middle classes, or the gentry, I suppose, and then to the middle classes, and particularly to the middle classes as you come into the 18th century, where there's a boom in recipe writing amongst women, actually, in England throughout the 18th century, middle class women writing collections of recipes. So they have a much richer tradition to draw on in that regard. But we can maybe assume, and this is kind of the area of assumption, that Ireland is doing kind of the same thing. And if you look at one of the big writers from the 18th century, for instance, kind of the celebrity, if you like, writer in that period is a woman called Hannah Glass. And she's publishing her book of recipes for the first time in 1747 from England. And what you see is that that book is coming to Ireland and it's hugely popular. And editions of it are printed in Dublin and elsewhere. So that book is circulating and other books are circulating as well. So what Ireland is doing is that it's aligning very much to a British way with food. It really is. But there is also then because Ireland it's a very complex sort of story, and that's what makes it interesting. Those recipes would have met a particular social group. They would have met people who could speak English, who were maybe living close to accessing the ingredients that the recipes needed. So you're talking about maybe the bigger towns, and you're certainly talking about the cities along the coast, the big cities that are all along the coast. If you go from Dublin down and even up to Belfast, they're all coastal areas. And of course, they have a well-established tradition of trading not just with the UK, but also trading with the Baltic, and especially trading with the Mediterranean countries. So those ingredients and that diversity of foods and ingredients are coming into those coastal towns since the medieval period. And you have a culture built up there, which is very, very different. And you must assume a food culture, which is very, very different to the culture that you might find in some rural part of Ireland, in the Midlands and the West Coast, in West Cork, up into Donegal and Mayo and Sligo. If you're out in the wilds of those places, how are you going to access those ingredients unless you make a journey to the nearest village or town? Is there going to be a retail establishment there that's going to have those? Is there the knowledge and the culture of using those ingredients? There probably isn't. So in that respect, that rural demographic of a certain socioeconomic standing is doing is that they're cooking and using ingredients that are, for the most part, home produced. So you're talking about a very close connection here between production and consumption. So they're producing and they're making for themselves the foods they're going to consume. And what you're dealing with in that regard are things like a cereal base, potatoes, when the potato becomes popular throughout the 18th century. Before that, it would have been oats. Some volumes of barley and wheat to some extent, but not extensive. And then you're dealing with kind of maybe dairy produce. So they're making a whole collection of different types of dairy produce, milk, soured milks, some hard cheeses, butter, of course. But that's a complicated story too, because that doesn't stay static, that story. You're dealing with things like meat, and the big one in Ireland would have been, as you're coming into a different kind of economic culture, the big one in Ireland would have been the pig, because you could keep the pig quite easily. The pig could just live outside, and he could even live with you in the house, And then when the time came to slaughter the pig, the pig was very, very economical, because the pig looked after the food waste, because he ate it. And then when the slaughter time came, every scrap of the pig was utilised and consumed, or it was either eaten fresh, it was salted to preserve it, or it was converted into puddings with the blood and the intestine and
Mm.
so on. So that animal was really very economical, and it made very, very good sense, because the animal ate waste, so you didn't have to deal with the waste. And it it was easy to keep, it was easy to manage if you were in a rural context. And then on the slaughtering and so on, it gave you very good returns. Other animals, larger animals like cattle and sheep or goats but would you slaughter the cow yourself? You might, you mightn't. Did you have cows where was it a milch cow for milking, or was it for beef? Sheep, the same story. The goat is interesting because the goat was really very popular in Ireland. We tend to forget it now. The goat was a very popular animal because, again, it was easy to keep. Well, goats can be temperamental, but within reason, he was easy to keep. And you could get all sorts of things from the goat, not just meat, but you also got milk. And the goat was very important, as were sheep, but the goat was particularly important, and it's something that we forget about. So if you look at kind of accounts of Irish stew, for instance, which we would take to be one of those heritage dishes, if you like, a traditional dish, that originally in some of the accounts would have been made with goat meat, and particularly the neck area up around here of the animal, which is both bone, meat, and fat, which of course in a casserole situation, a stewing situation, is very good because it's going to give you flavour, and it's going to give you a certain viscosity as well in the dish. So it's a very interesting story because we can't talk about just one food identity for Ireland. It depends on where you are, what time you're in, and it depends on who you are in terms of your socioeconomic status. And because Ireland has complicated all of these things through time, and because it's connected to Britain very much, not just in terms of observing food fashions, but it's also part of the empire. And what's happening in that context for Ireland is that it's looking at, it's got an Anglo-Irish gentry population who are looking to Britain, England, as kind of their homeland, really, if you like. So they're taking in all of the cultural influences food-wise from there. But the other thing that happens for Ireland in the colonial context, particularly when the empire establishes, is that Ireland is looked upon um, as a place that produces food to service the empire. So it's going to become a big commercial producer of foods, salted beef and salted butter, and other things as well, like small bits of cheese and bread and pork and all that sort of stuff. But the two big ones would be salted beef and salted butter. So Ireland becomes an area where those foods are being produced on a commercial basis to support a lot of the imperial activities of the empire, if you like. And what happens back home is that development in food production, which is happening in Ireland since the middle of the 17th century, where food becomes a big commercial entity produced on scale as a commodity. Back home then, and that's going on to a market. Back home then, that development is going to have ripple effects for what you might call a mainstream diet for ordinary Irish people, in that a lot of the stuff is taken out of the diet now, particularly like the dairy produce tradition is going to be affected because a lot of the milk now is going into butter production. The value of land and so on is going to increase because of the value of produce that's coming off the land. So that all is going to have implications for the diet of Irish people, especially as you move through the 18th century. And that interrupts tradition and inheritance and continuities and all sorts of stuff. So, like, the first question that we spoke about at the start, where there's this impression that Irish food is very bland and simple, is true in some ways. But then when you look at what's happening to food in Ireland, there is a kind of a complexity there which is much deeper than people, I think, realise. And that then has that ripple effect, consequential effect, on how we pass on traditions and how we perceive a traditional base for food in Ireland.
Absolutely, yeah. And you mentioned there, you said, okay, we used to have oats a lot more in our diet, and then we switched to potato. Was that because we were exporting more of our dairy out and potato was there and it was just easy to grow and cheap?
Yeah, I mean oats. I mean, I'm very fond of oats. I have kind of got a because I think they're the unsung hero of Irish traditional food. Um, I mean, oats would have been very popular simply because it goes back just to a very practical reason, is that oats grow very well in Ireland. Oats don't mind a lack of sunshine. They don't really mind acidic soils. They don't mind the dampness, which is kind of environmentally is Ireland. So oats grow very well. So the return for oats is really good. In contrast to wheat, which demands higher levels of sunshine and so on. Wheat grows well in Ireland, but it's just oats is kind of like the crop that you can rely on, really. Even though, I mean, there's a vast tradition of growing wheat down on the east coast and into parts of Munster, especially from the Anglo-Norman period onwards, where it becomes a huge commodity and actually goes on to the export market at that point in time as well. Like really, oats is the one that grows really well. It suits Ireland. And then it's very versatile because you can make dried things from it, like oat cakes. They're not cakes, they're more like kind of biscuity type breads. You can make those. And then you can make porridges, and you can make sort of different types of consistencies of wet kind of porridgey type dishes. You can add oats into pot dishes, just to give it a bit of substance. And then you can actually produce a fermented dish from oats as well, which is called bull's milk or sowens, depending on who's telling you about it. And that gives you this kind of gelatinous type dish that was used because it's using the residue of the oat rather than the kernel of the oat. It's when you grind the oats, there is a lot of, when you separate the internal grain from all of the protective fibrous matter around it, that's collected, and that was the item that was fermented. So again, it goes back to this idea of wasting nothing. So oats is very versatile. The thing about oats though is that you can't produce a leavened bread from oats, no matter what you do with it. You won't get a raised loaf like you will with wheat, right? So you're kind of limited in terms of the bread varieties there that you can, or the types of dried baked goods that you can produce from oats. But they were hugely popular, and they remain hugely popular in even when the potato becomes increasingly popular throughout the 18th century. People are still growing oats. They're selling some of them on, or they're consuming some of them. And as the potato becomes much more popular in the diet in the opening decades of the 19th century, oat consumption goes down in some areas, but it's maintained up in the northern Ulster regions. And in a little pocket of Ulster as well, it remains, cultivation-wise, it retains a presence. And after the famine in the second half of the 19th century, there is a bit of a recovery for oats. So it recovers again in terms of its cultivation and so on. And it kind of makes its way back into the diet then again. And of course, remains with us up to a present day context where it's still, I suppose you could say, a traditional Irish breakfast grain or cereal in the form of porridge, or overnight oats now if you want to be a bit more trendy.
You were talking about the bull's milk. I'd only heard about that. I interviewed someone earlier on this podcast, Deirdre O'Neill from Remnants of Our Past, and she was telling me about that. And I was thinking about cultured foods or pickled foods, because I know a lot of other people in Northern Europe, they would have pickled things because it would preserve it. Did Ireland have much of a culture of that?
Well, it depends on how you're preserving the food. So the preservation or the curing will be different. I mean, the curing method for our two big curing methods for Ireland would have been salting and smoking. So they're not going to produce fermented foods for you. So I'm talking about salted meat and salted fish for the most part. And then air drying doesn't really suit Ireland because the climate is too humid. It can in some instances, but it's not very reliable. And then the other thing is smoking, particularly smoking meat or smoking fish. And so they're the two preservation methods traditionally. In terms of fermented foods, I suppose the ones that we forget that are fermented are cheeses. These are all fermented products. And there would have been, again, now how to measure the extent, all of these things you can't quantify, and it's all kind of qualitative evidence you're dealing with. But there was a tradition of producing fermented milky things and fermented cheeses going into the later medieval period, before the plantations in the late 16th and through the 17th centuries, before things changed and before Ireland is kind of sucked into this kind of mercantile economy of the empire, well, the colonization and so on. So before that, you do have those, the cheese and the milky things would have been, I think, the big fermented foods that were fermented to preserve them.
Okay, I see.
Things like things like the bull's milk has got a little bit of maturation going on, depending on how long you let the chaff soak. Obviously, yeah,
Okay. Yeah, I'd love to try it someday. I'm sure it's great for you.
Yeah, and it makes very good economic sense because it's using everything in the grain.
Yeah, exactly. That's definitely something we were very, very good at. So, just to focus a little bit more on the potato, Regina, without being too stereotypical about it, we obviously became extremely reliant on it. And as we all know, we had the famine then. And then after that, in terms of the people who were obviously extremely affected by this, do you think that the famine affected our food eating or I suppose our psychological relationship with food afterwards?
I know, and this is something I hear quite a lot, and people talk about it from different perspectives, like how you can detect it, particularly in terms of a literary tradition, how the famine is either in a very explicit or implicit way is stitched into the Irish psyche as represented through literary endeavors. There's a lot about that. The thing, I suppose, is that like the thing to talk about, yeah, and there's this, this idea of survivor guilt as well, because not everybody in Ireland died as a result of the famine, and those who died uh, are gone, and they were a certain social demographic. Those who emigrated are gone as well, if you like, and those who survived are the people who didn't starve during the famine, which is you and me are the living remnant of that. So there are people who didn't die either, and
Hmm.
who didn't weren't affected by the famine and weren't hungry. That it is attached to a very particular social demographic, and then they disperse in different ways. So who then is left and is I don't know how you would actually don't know how you I don't know how you kind of seek out in a substantial way the answer to that question. I mean, there is, if you look at the folklore accounts, which are numerous, of course, there is a very strong memory of the famine. And the memory of the famine is they can recall what happened and they recall the devastation of it and from a very, not just the devastation of it in a kind of a practical way, but also from the emotional perspective. But then I don't know how you quantify how that kind of spills over into eating habits, for instance.
I sometimes wonder, and maybe again, is this just anecdotal evidence that I'm maybe pulling upon here? When you think about, say, someone goes over to their granny's house and the granny is kind of like force feeding them almost. They're like, we have this food, so you must eat it. Or you go home and have dinner with your family and your mother piles a plate so high with potato, you don't know if you'll be able to eat it all. And I suppose a little part of me is just wondering, is it, maybe are we a little bit different to some other different nations and how their relationship with food is because of the famine? Like, are we almost like eating more? Like, are our portions larger? I used to live in Spain and they're notorious for going out for a big family meal and they might get two dishes between 12 of them or something like that. But I mean, it's hard to compare these things. I do sometimes wonder, like, are we just like really into our giant plates of food maybe as a result?
I don't know either, and I've often wondered the same thing because there's a sense of security in that. There's bulk on the plate, if you like, I suppose.
Hmm.
And not only that's one part of it, but the other part of it is there's, like you were talking about your granny trying to feed you and feed you and feed you, but there's also then the onus on those who are consuming that they eat it all, that you don't leave anything, if you
Mm,
pick at it, that's not good. Or if you leave a substantial amount behind, that's not good either. So
yeah.
it's kind of, it works both ways, the provider and those being provided for. If you like, the person who's making the food, your granny in this instance, where the objective here is bulk and ensuring that you as the consumer is not left hungry.
Yeah.
And then there is an onus on you, though, because it's a two-way relationship here now. There's an onus on you then to almost subconsciously be aware of what's going on at the other end and to react to that in consuming everything and not letting anything behind. So there's a
Yeah.
sense of this kind of security around it,
Hmm.
connected with hunger and bulk. So I don't know. I don't know, to be perfectly honest, because I mean, if I had to, if there was maybe a gun to my head and I had to answer the question, I would say, yeah, that there is some fossilized memory of famine expressed in these different rituals around serving food and that relationship of the server and the consumer. And I would say there's some crystallized, fossilized memory in that. But then how do you go about it? I mean, it would be a very interesting research project. How would you go about actually substantiating that?
Yeah, no, it's not an easy thing to measure, right? Something else, I suppose, we might like to consume in large quantities, or at least we're known for, would be alcohol. So I'd love to learn a bit more about our ancestors' relationship with alcohol and how that has developed over time.
Gosh, and now this is another sticky question for me because I stay away from drink for the most part. I
Okay.
don't look at the history of drink because it's a whole other area itself.
Hmm.
So I don't look at that. But I mean, what I can say are the general things that, Ireland has a very, very long, as all the cultures do have, has a very, very long tradition. Actually, and I forgot to mention this because my head is always in the food area, not the drink, which is the other big food or other item of fermentation that we produce really well is beers.
Hmm.
So, and ale, so there's a very strong tradition of ale making in Ireland. What I mean by that is making this alcoholic beverage without hops, so just producing a non-hopped alcoholic drink, ale. So there's a very fine tradition of that and making it with all different mixed grains, not just barley as we would today, but doing mixed grain preparations as well. And then you get, usually it's assigned to the Anglo-Normans that they would come with a taste for hopped alcoholic drinks, making beer, and that becomes a feature of Ireland at that point in time. And then there's of course the big traditions of distillation, which come later on, then come in that later medieval period as well, that the skills and the knowledge of distilling grain beyond the beer and the ale stage to make a distillation into a spirit. That happens in the later medieval period as well. So you get the distillation from grains, and then you get the distillation from potatoes into poteen, for example. And then that, of course, then takes on a commercial skin when you come into, I suppose, when you come into the whole commercialization era from the middle of the 17th century onwards. And you get the emergence of the commercial breweries and distilleries. And they're very strong in terms of, I suppose, an Irish identity and all of that sort of stuff. And you get the beer making going on at home still, but more so you get, to some extent, but more so you get the illicit distillation of a grain spirit or a potato spirit in the form of poteen. So that's the homemade kind of tradition, and then the commercial tradition is very strong in terms of kind of the reputation of drinking and so on. That's not something that that's not something I'm familiar with from a research perspective. But that's all going on in that regard. The other thing I suppose for Ireland that we tend to forget about when we think about Ireland is the wine consumption, and wine has embedded itself into Irish culture since oh gosh, possibly the prehistoric period. So wine has been imported, certainly been imported in the early historic period, wine coming in from the Mediterranean. And that trade maintains all through time, and especially booms in the 18th century when the connections between Bordeaux and Claret and all sorts of stuff becomes particularly strong. And again, all of those items coming into those coastal port towns. So you have access to those fine wines and sweetened fortified wines happening around those areas too. So that's all really well established.
And with those wines, because I didn't know this at all, this is new information for me. I probably would have thought that Irish people, stuck to their beer and their whiskies and hutchings and stuff. But so this is something that's going back years, and that would it be the average Irish person, or are we talking about people with a bit more money?
Yeah. So that's why it's hard to answer any question because it depends on who you are and where you are in time and how much money you have to spend or what you have to exchange. So yeah, wine would have been, well, first of all, wine, like the boon and the trade for wine in the early historic period would be its connection with the rituals of the church, that they needed wine for liturgical reasons. So the trade would have been coming in that regard in the first instance. But it becomes a drink of secular society as well. But again, it depends on where you are. Do you have access to the wine coming in, and have you the money to buy it? So it would be more associated with those wealthier classes, if you like, in certain geographic areas of Ireland.
Okay.
So when you come into the early historic period and the later historic period, and I suppose when I'm talking about the later historic period, I'm talking about the upsurge in all sorts of activities that come as a result of the Anglo-Norman presence in Ireland from the middle of the 12th century onwards. and then going into the 13th and 14th and 15th centuries. The wine that's coming into Ireland there is extensive. Do you know, it's coming into the towns and the cities. The wine merchants are in these towns, and other spice merchants and all sorts of merchants are there. Luxury exotic ingredients, the merchants that are dealing in that trade. And wine is a big part of that, a huge part of that. So there is a market for it, but you have to have the money to buy it. And then it becomes, it then becomes part of your identity of consumption, depending on your status.
So the average person, they would have been sticking to the things that they could produce themselves on their own land, I'm assuming. Or if, as you said, they could kind of maybe exchange or trade with people around them. I just wanted to take a very quick pause in the middle of this wonderful episode with Regina to remind you that I'm asking you for your support. So, this is the final episode of season 2. I would really appreciate if you have enjoyed any of these episodes in the season, the podcast, the guests, whatever, that you would donate me the price of a coffee. The link is in the description. Click it, make sure that you open it in your browser and that you don't download the app because it's going to cost you more. And that money goes straight to the creator through Patreon. And I would really, really appreciate that. Thank you so much. And let's get back to the interview. Something I actually want to move on to a little bit more now is maybe some iconic like Irish brands when it comes to food. And one that I suppose sticks out to a lot of people is Tayto. And I heard something before. I'd love to check it with you to see if you know any more on it. Did Tayto invent the flavoured crisp?
So they say. And yeah, so they say. And that's why it became so popular, because it had this kind of taste explosion, in your mouth. So yeah, an Irish company, not so now anymore, but an Irish company, and iconic. And not so crisps existed before Tayto, and you'll see all sorts of claims as to who invented the crisp back in the 19th century in particular. And then you come into the 20th century and they become available more so on a commercial basis rather than just slicing them, putting them into hot fat. So yeah, they become this part of the commercial life of the 19th and 20th centuries. But they came in little packets that you self-salted. You salted them yourselves. You probably know this. So the crisps came in their packets, and they had a little sachet of salt, which you opened and you salted the crisps. So they remind me, because I have a memory of those as well, I have to say, they remind me of the type of crisp you might get, for example, in the supermarkets in France or Spain, where they're very kind of, for Irish people, they go in and they see all of these lovely crisps, and then you open the bag and you taste them, and you're really disappointed because they don't
Yeah.
have that flavour hit. So, and those crisps of the little sachets remind me of those ones in the continental supermarkets that you find in the continent. And then you have this Tayto development, whereby they develop this flavouring that goes in the crisp, which is quite extraordinary. Cheese and onion, which is more than salt, obviously, and it's secret, whatever that is. So yeah, that is something that is associated with Tayto.
I feel like it's like not that known. Whenever I mention it to someone, they're quite surprised. But
I think because now the crisp market has become so huge and so diverse, people tend to forget that if you were in the crisp world back in in the middle of the middle of the century in Ireland, and your choice was a bag of crisps with that little sachet of salt or the Tayto, like the distance between those two products was extreme. So this was a huge development flavor wise. So, I mean, if this comes up in conversation at another time, just remind them that the fact that these crisps were very bland, and then Tayto comes along with this, this other explosion of flavor in a bag, which was lovely. I mean,
Mhm.
and it's so characteristic of Tayto. I've never tasted anywhere else in crisps. It's a very unique flavor concoction, whatever the secret recipe is there. It is very distinctive and very very unique to Tayto in that regard.
Mhm.
And that's why they became this iconic thing, because they were lovely.
Yeah, yeah, they did it. They did the job very well, essentially.
Yeah, they did. And they still do. They
They
still
still
do.
do. Yeah, absolutely. Are there any other like classic Irish food brands or stories associated with food brands that are a little bit interesting or like uniquely Irish in any sense?
I think the one that I like is the Jacobs. Jacobs is an Irish company, and It's an Irish brand. And I did some work way back in the 1990s on this European project with Teagasc, and it was a project called Euro Terroir, where each of the, at that point in the late 1990s, each of the EU member countries were recording their traditional foods, but they had to go through a level of processing. It couldn't be milk, for instance. It had to be cheese. Right? So, in that project, we looked at Jacobs as being a traditional, and the products that they produced. They've been traditional to Ireland. You know, they have location specific and so on, and producing goods that are quite unique to Ireland as well. So, for example, Jacobs would be very proud of the fact that they invented the cream cracker. So the cream cracker is an Irish invention. And then as well, the high profile biscuits like Kimberley, Mikado, and coconut creams. So these were their lines in the early years of Jacobs. And they were really interesting because they developed, you know, it's back in the late 19th century. We think about food marketing in a present day context. They were thinking about food marketing too. And the Mikado, for instance, was named after the opera, the Mikado.
Oh.
So that was really kind of circulating in the zeitgeist. And then they produced a biscuit called Mikado. So you can see, you know, that the excitement that was from marketing built around that was really good. And then the Kimberley biscuit, if you think about the Kimberley biscuit, it's got two spheres, kind of a bit of ginger flavored biscuit, and there's marshmallow between those. And if you look at the marshmallow, and I haven't looked at this now for quite a while, so I'm open to correction if it's changed. But if you look at the marshmallow, that's decorated with fairly distinctive grains of sugar that are going around the marshmallow. So it's not like table sugar grain size, and certainly not like icing sugar. The grains of sugar were substantially bigger. They're not huge now, but they're substantially bigger. And each of those grains was supposed to represent one of the diamonds from the Kimberley mines, because the Kimberley
Wow.
mines were in the news at the time. So Kimberley, Mikado and coconut creams, and Jacob's cream crackers, I think and Tayto, I think these are iconic Irish brands. And of course, the other one that we can't let out is Kerrygold. I mean, that has been just such a story of success and just superlative marketing, really, since 1962. And that revolutionized kind of the butter industry for Ireland in terms of export markets, and an incredible product as well to go with the profile that was created for it.
Yeah, absolutely huge. I love seeing the Americans online getting their Kerry bowl delivered over to them because it really is the best butter. Like you can't
Yeah.
get any better than that. I'm conscious of time, and also I'm conscious that the listeners may be getting a little bit hungry listening to all of this, Regina. I'm going to finish off this episode with the question that I ask everybody else. So for you, what does it mean to be Irish?
Okay. So I thought about this in two ways. One of them food, and the other one not food. So I thought the first one, which I suppose I'm getting a bit older now as you go through life, and you kind of start kind of looking around at life and all that sort of stuff. And I suppose the big one for me for being Irish is, I think, the sense of freedom that we have in Ireland, and that goes back, I suppose, to the whole political system and all sorts of stuff. And I think we're very fortunate to live in a society where we have so many freedoms. And I think that's actually incredible in the world that we're living in at the moment, where you see people who are denied freedoms or freedoms taken from them. So to live in a society where we're free and we're fairly secure, I think is invaluable. And sometimes I think we forget that. So I think that's one of the big things about being Irish. I think that's very, very important. The other thing connects with food, of course. And I think what we might as well overlook to some extent is the fact that Ireland has been, through time and up to the present day, has been such an incredible food producing island, you know, and we're still very close to the source of production, that we can, if we have the interest, we can see who's producing our food, how it's being produced. We're very close to the land still. I mean, we can just travel a few miles outside the cities. We're in the countryside, where we can see a lot of the food production going on, you know. And I think that's incredible that we have that close continuing relationship with food and food production, with the land, with farming and farmers, the unsung heroes really of the food story. So that connection to the land in terms of understanding food, I think, is crucial. And I think it's crucial, particularly in a present day context where everything is changing so rapidly and so quickly, and where all of those connections between food, understanding and knowing how it's produced is breaking down, and people are very confused and disconnected, and the whole food producing world has disappeared for a lot of people. And I think we're at a very important time where Ireland, maybe in the global food system, has to maybe recognize that the value of what we do and what we've done all through time as this leading food producing island. And for that to be threatened in ways that really worries me, in that break with food connections, which is happening. But I think that's something that we don't maybe celebrate as much as we should do. We might just kind of assume that we know it, so we don't celebrate it. But then there is a younger generation who don't have an understanding of that either, which is quite worrying. So I think that's what it means for me. That closeness to food, the sites of food production, is very important and is a big characteristic of Ireland. And I think that we should recognise that and value it, and almost, have some system of protecting that too.
Absolutely. Yeah. Our connection to the land and then the food that we produce on it has been a very important thing for our up until very recent history. And as you said, yeah, I feel like it's only started to change. You've got your old El Paso packs in the press and your Dolmio sauce, whereas before that, as you said, it was like you ate what you could grow on your land or what you could get your hands on. So hopefully, I think there's been a good movement recently. I think COVID helped because it forced people to slow down and they had to shop in their local area because they couldn't go too much further away. And I think it did help us get a bit of more of an appreciation for some local products. But yeah, we've a long way to go, and we should definitely be focusing on that and the people that contribute to
Mm.
that. Yeah. Okay, so thank you so much, Regina. Gur míle míle maith agat.
You're
Do you
welcome.
do you have anything else to add? Do you have anything that you'd like the listeners to be aware of? Any upcoming projects or anything like that?
No, I suppose the one that I am involved in is the one that you mentioned. We're looking at the concept of the recipe. In that relish, that's an EU Horizon project. We're looking at the concept of the recipe and what that means in different cultures across Europe. It's a European-wide project. And that really is very interesting in an Irish context where recipes don't exist, or looking at different forms of the recipes. So I might be reaching out to people there as regards recipes as well at some point in time.
Okay, brilliant. Very best of luck with that.
And thanks for the invitation. Yeah,
You're
it was
so
lovely to
welcome.
talk to you. Yeah.
You too. Thank you so much, Regina. Really appreciate it. Slán.
So
Mila 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 Buikas for listening to this episode of How to Be Irish with Regina Sexton. Again, I'll remind you, if you have the means to, please click the link in the description. Buy me a coffee. I'd really appreciate that. Helps me cover the cost of running this podcast. If not, share it with a friend, post it on your Instagram story. Spread the good word. I'd really appreciate that. So thank you so much for listening, and I'll see you next season for more How to Be Irish. Slán live.